A widow's whisper cuts through a blizzard. We haven't eaten in days. The butcher turns away. The town pretends not to hear. 5 children huddle against their mother, too weak to cry. This is the moment before everything changes, when a scarred cowboy with empty pockets and a haunted past makes a choice that will cost him everything. But before I tell you how one man's impossible promise saved a dying family in the frozen heart of Wyoming, I need you to do something. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The wind didn't howl in Ash Hollow. It screamed. It tore through the Wyoming territory like a living thing made of ice and rage, ripping wooden signs from their chains, sending horses stamping nervous in their stalls, turning the January marketplace into a battleground where only the desperate dared to venture. The year was 1884 and winter had arrived early and cruel, burying the mountain passes under 10 feet of snow and trapping the small frontier town in a frozen fist that showed no mercy. Clara Dawson stood at the edge of that marketplace like a ghost among the living. She was 27 years old, though grief and hunger had carved lines around her eyes that made her look 40. Her dress, once a respectable blue calico, hung loose on a frame that had shed 20 pounds in 3 months. The fabric was patched at the elbows and hem, mended so many times the original cloth was barely visible beneath the layers of repair. Her dark hair, which she'd once worn in elaborate braids that her husband Thomas had loved to touch, now hung in a simple knot at the base of her neck, greasy and dull from weeks without proper washing. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They were the eyes of a woman who had already died once and was simply waiting for her body to catch up with the fact. Around her clustered 5 children, ages 2 to 9, each one thinner than seemed possible for a living thing. The oldest, Margaret, called Maggie, pressed close to her mother's side, her small hand gripping Clara's threadbare coat. At 9 years old, Maggie had already learned to read the angles of her mother's face, to know when silence was the only safe response. Her younger sister, Elizabeth, Lizzie, with her father's red hair and her mother's stubborn chin, stood just behind, holding the hand of 6-year-old Samuel, whose cough had grown worse with each passing week. The twins, Thomas Jr. and Michael, stood together as they always did, 2 halves of the same whole, their identical faces hollow-cheeked and pale. They were 4 years old and had already forgotten what it felt like to go to bed with a full stomach. And in Clara's arms, wrapped in a blanket so thin it barely qualified as cloth, baby Grace whimpered softly, too weak even to cry with conviction. "Mama?" Maggie whispered, her breath frosting in the air. "Mama, I'm cold." Clara pulled her daughter closer, but she had no warmth to offer. Her own body had long since stopped generating heat it couldn't afford to spare. "I know, sweetheart, just a little longer." But Maggie was too old to be comforted by empty promises. "You said that yesterday." Clara had no answer for that. Yesterday, she had indeed said the same thing, and the day before that, and the day before that. Each morning she woke in the freezing boarding house room, the one they'd been lucky to get, the landlady had said, though Clara was beginning to understand that luck had different definitions for different people, and each morning she promised her children that today would be different. Today they would eat. Today someone would help. Today had been a lie every single time. The marketplace bustled around them with an activity that felt obscene in its normalcy. Ranchers haggled over cattle prices. The blacksmith's hammer rang against his anvil in a steady rhythm that echoed off the frozen ground. Women in fur-lined coats and warm boots moved from stall to stall, their baskets filling with meat and bread and cheese, with potatoes and carrots and dried apples. The smell of fresh baking drifted from the bakery on the corner, so thick and rich that Samuel actually moaned. "Mama, please," he whispered. "Please." Clara's hands trembled. In her pocket she carried 3 pennies, every cent she had left in the world. Thomas had left debts when he died, debts she hadn't known about, debts that had swallowed their small ranch and everything they owned. The bank had been apologetic but firm. The creditors had been neither. She'd managed to save a few pieces of clothing, Thomas's pocket watch, which she'd already sold, and her wedding ring, which she wore on a string around her neck, hidden beneath her dress. She couldn't sell it. Not yet. It was the last piece of Thomas she had, the last proof that she'd once been loved, that she'd once belonged to something bigger than this desperate scramble for survival. But as she looked down at Grace's pale face, at the way the baby's eyes had started to sink into her skull, Clara knew that sentiment was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Stay here," she told Maggie, pressing the baby into her daughter's arms. "Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. I'll be right back." Maggie's eyes widened with fear. At 9 years old, she understood what her mother was about to do, understood the humiliation that was coming. "Mama, no! Stay here, Margaret." Clara used her daughter's full name, the one that meant there would be no argument, and Maggie's mouth snapped shut. She took Grace carefully, supporting the baby's head the way Clara had taught her, and pressed close to Lizzie and Samuel and the twins, all of them huddling together for warmth and courage. Clara walked toward the butcher's stall with her spine straight and her head high, even though everything inside her was screaming to run, to hide, to disappear into the snow and never come back. But she couldn't run. She had 5 reasons why she couldn't run, and they were all watching her with eyes that trusted her to fix this, to make it better, to be the mother who could save them, even though she had no idea how. The butcher's name was Henry Walsh, and he was a large man with hands like slabs of beef, and a face that had been kind before years of frontier life had taught him that kindness was expensive. His stall was piled with cuts of meat, venison and beef and pork, rabbit and wild turkey, and even a haunch of bear that someone had brought down from the high country. The sight of it all, the sheer abundance of it, made Clara's stomach clench so hard she thought she might vomit. When had she last eaten? 2 days ago? 3? She'd been giving her portions to the children, lying about having eaten earlier, watching them devour the scraps she could afford, while her own body slowly consumed itself. "Mr. Walsh," she said quietly. He didn't look up from the ham he was trimming. "Mrs. Dawson." His tone was neutral, carefully polite in that way that told Clara everything she needed to know. He'd already decided not to help. Whatever she was about to ask, the answer would be no. But she had to try anyway because the alternative was watching her children die, and she wasn't ready for that. She would never be ready for that. "Mr. Walsh, The words stuck in her throat like glass. She'd never begged before, never had to. Thomas had always provided, had always made sure they had enough. Even in the lean times, even when the cattle prices dropped or the winter feed cost more than they could afford, there had always been food on the table. Always. But Thomas was 8 months dead, buried in a grave she couldn't afford a headstone for. And Clara was alone with 5 children and 3 pennies and a pride that was killing them all. "I was wondering," she started again, forcing the words out through sheer desperation, "if you might have any scraps, anything you were going to throw away, bones for soup maybe, or—" "No scraps today." His knife moved steadily through the meat, precise and efficient. "Sorry." But he wasn't sorry. Clara could hear it in his voice, could see it in the way he refused to meet her eyes. He wasn't sorry at all. "Please." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "My children. We haven't eaten in days." That got his attention. He looked up, and for just a moment Clara saw something flicker in his eyes. Pity, maybe. Or disgust. She couldn't tell which, and she found that she didn't care. She'd take either if it meant food for her babies. "Mrs. Dawson," Walsh said slowly, setting down his knife, "I sympathize with your situation, I really do, but I got a business to run. I can't be giving away product to every He stopped himself, but the damage was done. Every what? Every widow? Every beggar? Every desperate woman with too many mouths to feed and not enough money to feed them?" "I can pay," Clara said quickly, pulling the 3 pennies from her pocket. They looked pathetic in her palm, barely enough to buy a single potato. "I know it's not much, but I can work. I can clean or sew or I don't need help." Walsh picked up his knife again, dismissing her. "Try the church. Maybe Pastor Williams has something." Clara had already tried the church. Pastor Williams had been kind but helpless. His own charity stores depleted by the harsh winter and the number of families in need. He'd given her a loaf of bread 3 days ago and said to come back at the end of the week, but the end of the week might as well be the end of the world. Her children needed food now, today, this minute. "Please," she whispered again, hating herself for the desperation in her voice, for the tears that burned behind her eyes. Please, I'm begging you." Walsh's jaw tightened. He was angry now. She could see it. Angry at her for making him feel guilty, for forcing him to be the villain in this story. "I said no. Now move along before you drive away my paying customers." Clara stood there for one more moment, 3 pennies clutched in her hand, her children's hunger like a physical weight on her shoulders. Then she turned away, defeated, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. She made it 3 steps before she heard a voice behind her. "Hold on!" Clara turned, hope flaring so bright and sudden in her chest that it hurt. But it wasn't Walsh who had spoken. It was a woman in a fox fur coat and expensive boots, her basket already full of purchases. She was looking at Clara with an expression that might have been compassion if it weren't so clearly contaminated with judgment. "Are you really that desperate?" the woman asked, loud enough that several other people turned to look. "That you'd beg in the middle of the marketplace?" Clara felt her face burn despite the cold. Around them, other townsfolk had stopped their business to watch, drawn by the spectacle of public humiliation. She recognized some of them, the banker's wife, the mayor's daughter, the owner of the general store. Women who had once invited her to tea back when she was Thomas Dawson's respectable wife instead of Thomas Dawson's destitute widow. "I'm not begging," Clara said quietly, though that was exactly what she'd been doing. "I'm simply asking for help." "There's no difference." This came from another woman, younger, with a mean little smile. "If you can't feed your children, maybe you shouldn't have had so many of them." The words hit Clara like a fist. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, to explain that she'd had a husband and a ranch and a future, that she'd done everything right, that this wasn't supposed to happen. But what was the point? These women didn't want explanations. They wanted to feel superior, to reassure themselves that poverty was a choice, a moral failing, something that happened to other people because those people deserved it. "Come on, children," Clara said softly, her voice shaking. "Let's go." She turned to walk back to where her babies waited, but her vision had gone blurry with tears and shame and 3 days of near starvation, and she didn't see the patch of ice until her boot hit it. Her feet went out from under her and she fell hard, her hips striking the frozen ground with a crack that sent pain shooting up her spine. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not all of them. Some people looked away, embarrassed. But enough. Enough that Clara heard it, felt it like acid on her skin. "Mama!" Maggie's voice cut through the noise, high and terrified. Clara pushed herself up, ignoring the pain, ignoring the tears that now flowed freely down her cheeks, ignoring everything except the need to get to her children and get them away from this place, away from these people, away from this moment that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She'd made it halfway back to her children when she saw him. He was standing in the shadow between 2 buildings, so still that she almost missed him. A tall man, broad-shouldered, beneath a heavy coat that had seen better days. His hat was pulled low, hiding most of his face, but Clara could see the line of his jaw, dark with several days' worth of beard, and the set of his mouth, grim and hard and completely expressionless. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Not with judgment or pity or any of the emotions she'd been drowning in for the past 10 minutes. He was simply watching, seeing her, really seeing her, in a way that no one had since Thomas died. Clara didn't know why, but in that moment she felt more exposed than she had when she'd been begging Walsh for scraps. This stranger's gaze cut through all her careful defenses, all her attempts to maintain dignity in the face of destitution, and saw straight down to the terrified woman beneath. She looked away first, grabbing Maggie's hand and pulling her close, gathering the other children around her. Baby Grace had started to cry, a thin, weak sound that was somehow worse than screaming. "Mama, that man is looking at us," Lizzie whispered, pressing against her mother's side. "Don't look at him," Clara said automatically, though she found herself glancing back despite her own advice. He was still there, still watching. And now she could see more of him, the scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pale against weather-tanned skin. The way his hands hung loose at his sides, relaxed but ready. The quality of stillness that suggested a man who knew how to wait, who knew how to watch, who knew things that Clara probably didn't want to know. "Let's go," she murmured, steering her children away from the marketplace, away from the staring townsfolk, away from the stranger with the scarred face and the unsettling eyes. But as they walked, She felt his gaze on her back like a physical touch, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted, that some invisible line had been crossed. She didn't know then that the man's name was Rhett Callahan. She didn't know that he'd been standing in that shadow for 20 minutes, watching the marketplace with the patient attention of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing better to do. She didn't know that he'd heard every word of her humiliation, witnessed every moment of her desperate attempt to feed her children. And she definitely didn't know that as she walked away, broken and defeated, Rhett Callahan was making a decision that would change everything. The boarding house where Clara and her children lived was called the Silver Pine, though there was nothing silver about it, and the only pine in sight was the half-dead tree struggling to survive in the front yard. It was a 2-story structure that leaned slightly to the left, its paint long since scoured away by wind and weather, its windows drafty and its floors so warped that furniture had to be propped up with wooden shims to keep from sliding. Mrs. Beatrice Holloway owned the boarding house, and she ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of false gentility. She was a woman in her 50s, corseted tight and powdered thick, who spoke in a soft voice and smiled often and never let you forget that she held all the power in any interaction. Clara had been behind on rent for 2 weeks. She knew it. Mrs. Holloway knew it. The knowledge hung between them like a blade, and Clara spent every waking moment trying to figure out how to pay what she owed before the blade fell. The room Clara shared with her 5 children was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a narrow hallway that smelled of old cooking grease and mildew. It was barely big enough for the 2 beds they'd crammed inside, one for Clara and the baby, one for the other 4 children. There was no stove, no fireplace, just a small window that let in the cold and offered a view of the alley behind the building. Clara had been paying 75 cents a week for this privilege. She was currently $1.50 in arrears, with no idea where she'd find the money. When they reached the boarding house that afternoon, all 6 of them moving slowly through the brutal cold, Clara saw Mrs. Holloway waiting in the front parlor. She stood with her hands folded, her expression pleasant, and Clara's stomach dropped. "Mrs. Dawson," the landlady said warmly, "might I have a word?" "Children, go upstairs," Clara said immediately. Maggie understood instantly. She gathered the younger ones and herded them toward the stairs, Grace still whimpering in her arms. Lizzie looked back once, her eyes wide and scared, but Maggie pulled her along. Clara waited until she heard their footsteps on the floor above before she turned to face Mrs. Holloway. "I know what you're going to say," she began, "but if you could just give me a few more days—" "I'm afraid that's not possible." Mrs. Holloway's smile didn't waver. "You see, I have a new tenant interested in your room, a single gentleman who can pay 3 months in advance. Surely you understand that I must consider what's best for my business." Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. "You're evicting us." Such an ugly word. Mrs. Holloway tutted softly. "I prefer to think of it as making a practical business decision. I've been more than generous, Mrs. Dawson. Most landlords would have put you out after the first missed payment. I gave you 2 weeks. Please." The word was becoming too familiar on Clara's tongue, but she said it anyway. "Please, Mrs. Holloway, I'll find the money. I'll work. I'll do anything." "I'm sure you will. But you'll need to do it somewhere else." The landlady moved to the door and opened it, letting in a blast of frigid air. "I'll need you and your children out by sundown. That gives you—" She consulted a small watch pinned to her bodice. "Approximately 3 hours." "Out?" Clara's voice cracked. "Out where? There's nowhere." "That's hardly my concern." Mrs. Holloway's smile finally faded, replaced by something colder and more honest. "Perhaps if you'd thought about how to support 5 children before your husband died, you wouldn't find yourself in this position. Good day, Mrs. Dawson." Clara stood in the doorway, frozen, as the door clicked shut in her face. Around her, the temperature was already dropping as the sun sank lower toward the horizon. By nightfall, it would be well below 0. She had 3 hours to find shelter for 6 people in a town that had already made it clear they were on their own. Behind her, she heard the creak of footsteps on the stairs. She turned to find Maggie standing there, baby Grace in her arms, the other children clustered behind her. "Mama?" Maggie's voice was very small. "Are we leaving?" Clara looked at her daughter, too thin, too pale, too old for her 9 years, and felt something crack open in her chest. She wanted to scream, to rage, to grab Mrs. Holloway and shake her until she understood what she was doing, what it meant to throw children out into the cold. But none of that would help. None of that would keep them warm tonight. "Yes, sweetheart," Clara said softly. "We're leaving. Start gathering your things." There weren't many things to gather. They'd lost most of their belongings when they lost the ranch. What remained fit into 2 canvas bags that Clara had sewn from old flour sacks. Clothes, mostly, and a few precious items. A doll that had been Maggie's, a toy soldier that Samuel slept with, a carved horse that Thomas had made for the twins. 20 minutes later, they stood on the street with their bags and nowhere to go. The sun was a red wound on the horizon, bleeding out over the mountains. In another hour, it would be dark. In another 2 hours, it would be deadly. "Where are we going, Mama?" Lizzie asked, her hand tight in Clara's. Clara didn't know. The church would be locked by now. The other boarding houses were already full, and even if they weren't, Clara had no money for rent. She had 3 pennies and a wedding ring and 5 children who were looking at her with absolute faith that she would fix this. "I know a place," she lied, starting to walk. "Come on." They walked through the darkening streets of Ash Hollow, past houses where lamplight glowed warm in windows, where she could see families sitting down to dinner, where children laughed and played in front of fires that would burn all night. They walked past the church, dark and locked, past the general store, closed for the evening, past the saloon, where piano music drifted out along with the smell of whiskey and tobacco. They walked until they reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrubland and pine forest, where the wind blew unobstructed and the cold bit even deeper. And there, barely visible in the failing light, Clara saw it, a collapsed cabin, half buried in a snowdrift, its roof caved in on one side but the other still standing. It was the kind of place where animals denned for the winter, where drifters sometimes took shelter, where no decent person would ever choose to live. It would have to be enough. "Here," Clara said, trying to inject confidence into her voice. "We'll stay here tonight." She could feel her children's doubt, could see it in the way Maggie's face went carefully blank and Lizzie's lower lip started to tremble. But they didn't argue. They'd learned that lesson already, that Mama was doing her best, that questions made things harder, that sometimes you just had to trust even when trust felt impossible. The cabin's door hung crooked on broken hinges, and Clara had to shove hard to get it open. Inside, it was somehow colder than outside, the air stale and damp. There was no furniture, no glass in the windows, nothing but bare wooden walls and a floor strewn with leaves and animal droppings. "It's dark," Thomas Jr. whimpered. "I know, baby. Give Mama a minute." Clara set down their bags and the baby, then moved carefully around the small space. There, in the corner, a pile of old wood, probably left by whoever had abandoned this place. It was half rotten and probably full of insects, but it would burn. She'd sold Thomas's tinderbox weeks ago, but she'd kept a few matches wrapped in oilcloth, saved for emergencies. This, she decided, qualified as an emergency. Her hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to strike the match, but finally it caught, and she touched it carefully to the smallest piece of wood. The flame hesitated, flickered, then caught. She added more wood, building it slowly, nursing it like the precious thing it was. "Gather round," she told the children. "Get warm." They clustered around the tiny fire, their shadows huge and wavering on the walls. Clara pulled the blanket from their bag, just one blanket, thin and threadbare, and wrapped it around all of them, pulling them close to her body. Baby Grace had finally cried herself into silence, a small, limp weight against Clara's chest. "Tell us a story, Mama," Lizzie whispered. "I don't know any stories tonight, sweetheart. Tell us about Papa." Clara closed her eyes. Thomas? God, she missed him so much it was like a physical wound, like something vital had been carved out of her chest, and she was somehow still expected to keep living. He'd been a good man, a kind man, a man who'd worked hard and loved his family and tried his best. It wasn't his fault that trying hadn't been enough, that the debts had piled up despite his efforts, that the cattle prices had dropped and the feed had cost too much, and the bank had wanted its money now, right now, immediately. It wasn't his fault that he'd worked himself sick trying to save the ranch, that he'd spent a day digging fence posts in the rain and come home with a fever that wouldn't break, that in 3 days he'd gone from strong and healthy to delirious and dying. It wasn't his fault that he'd left her alone with 5 children and bills she couldn't pay and skills that weren't worth anything in a town that had no use for desperate widows. But he was gone, and she was here, and their children were hungry. "Papa loved you very much," Clara whispered, because it was true, and because it was all she had left to give them. "He would have done anything for you. He would have given everything." "Like the man today," Maggie said quietly. Clara's eyes opened. "What man?" "The man watching us. In the shadows. He had kind eyes." Clara remembered the scarred face, the unsettling intensity, the feeling of being seen. "He wasn't watching us, sweetheart. He was just there." "He was watching us," Maggie insisted. "And he looked sad, like he wanted to help but didn't know how." Clara didn't have the energy to argue. She simply held her children closer, feeling their small bodies shivering against hers despite the fire, despite the blanket, despite everything she was trying to do to keep them alive. Outside, the wind howled, and the temperature dropped, and the darkness pressed close. And somewhere in that darkness, a scarred man with sad eyes was making a decision that would save them all. Clara woke to the sound of whimpering. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The darkness was absolute. The cold so intense it felt like being buried alive in ice. Then memory crashed back. The eviction, the walk through town, the abandoned cabin. She was lying on the bare wooden floor with 5 children pressed against her body, sharing the single thin blanket that did almost nothing against the bitter cold. The whimpering came from Samuel. Even in sleep, his small body shook with coughs that rattled in his chest like stones in a can. Clara reached out in the darkness, finding his forehead with her hand. He was burning up. "No," she whispered. "Please, no." But prayer had stopped working for Clara Dawson months ago, around the time her husband started dying, and God apparently decided to look the other way. She lay there in the darkness, listening to her son struggle to breathe, feeling the other children shiver against her, and tried to calculate how much longer they could survive like this. 2 days? 3? The fire had died hours ago. She'd used the last of the wood, and the temperature inside the cabin was barely different from outside. Grace hadn't nursed properly in 2 days because Clara's own body, starved and depleted, had simply stopped producing milk. The baby was slowly dying of hunger in her arms, and there was nothing Clara could do about it. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the darkness, to Thomas, to God, to her children. "I'm so sorry." Maggie stirred against her side. "Mama?" "Shh, sweetheart, go back to sleep." "I can't. It's too cold." Maggie's voice was very small, very young. "Mama, are we going to die?" The question landed like a knife between Clara's ribs. 9 years old, and her daughter was already preparing for death. What kind of mother let things get this bad? What kind of mother brought her children to this frozen hell and then ran out of ways to save them? "No," Clara said firmly, making her voice strong even though everything inside her was crumbling. "No, baby, we're not going to die, I promise." It was a lie. She knew it was a lie. But sometimes lies were all you had left, and you told them anyway because the truth was too terrible to speak aloud. "Mama," Maggie whispered, "I'm scared." "I know, I'm scared too." They held each other in the darkness, mother and daughter, while around them the other children slept or tried to sleep, and the night stretched on forever. And Clara wondered if this was how it would end, all of them freezing together in an abandoned cabin, not dramatic or meaningful, just quiet and cold and forgotten. She must have dozed eventually because when she opened her eyes again, gray dawn light was seeping through the cracks in the walls. The children were still asleep, bundled together for warmth, their breath frosting in the air. Clara carefully extracted herself from the pile of small bodies, tucking the blanket around them, and stood up. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. She was so cold her joints had locked up, so stiff she could barely move. Her hip, where she'd fallen yesterday in the marketplace, throbbed with a deep, bruising pain. But she forced herself to walk to the door, forced herself to look out at the new day. Snow had fallen overnight, another 6 inches added to the already impossible drifts. The sky was the color of old iron, promising more to come. In the distance, she could see the town, Smoke rising from chimneys, life continuing for people who had roofs that didn't leak and fires that didn't die, and food in their pantries. Clara leaned against the doorframe and allowed herself exactly 1 minute of despair. 1 minute to feel the full weight of how badly she'd failed, how impossible this situation was, how much she wanted to just give up and let the cold take them all. Then she straightened her spine, wiped her eyes, and got to work. There was more wood outside. She'd seen it last night, fallen branches and dead logs scattered through the trees. If she could gather enough, she could keep the fire going. If she could keep the fire going, they could stay warm. If they stayed warm, they could survive one more day. And maybe in that day, something would change. Maybe someone would help. Maybe God would remember they existed. She was bending to pick up a branch, her hands already numb despite being wrapped in the remnants of an old shawl, when she saw it. A burlap sack sitting on the cabin's porch. Clara froze, staring at it like it might be a hallucination. But no, it was real. Solid. Actually there. She looked around quickly, scanning the tree line, the path back to town, anywhere someone might be watching. Nothing. Just empty white landscape and the distant shapes of buildings. With trembling hands, Clara picked up the sack. It was heavy. She pulled open the drawstring and looked inside. Bread. A full loaf of bread, still slightly warm. And beneath it, wrapped in cloth, 4 potatoes and a chunk of salt pork. Clara's legs went weak. She sat down hard on the porch, the sack clutched to her chest, and for a long moment she simply couldn't process what she was seeing. Food. Real food. Enough to feed her children for 2 days if she was careful. Mama? She turned to find Maggie standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes huge in her pale face. Mama, what is it? Clara couldn't speak. She just opened the sack and showed her daughter. Maggie's face transformed, hope and disbelief warring for dominance. Where did it come from? I don't know. Clara looked around again, but there was still no one visible. Someone left it for us. Who? I don't know that either, sweetheart, but right now, I don't care. Clara stood up, energy flooding back into her exhausted body. Wake your brothers and sisters. We're going to eat breakfast. The bread was the best thing Clara had ever tasted. Even though it was plain wheat bread with no butter, nothing fancy. She tore it into 6 pieces, giving each child a portion and taking the smallest for herself. The potatoes she'd saved for later, and the salt pork. God, the salt pork would make a soup that could last them days. She watched her children devour the bread with an intensity that made her heart ache. They didn't talk, didn't play, just focused on the food with complete concentration, as if afraid it might disappear if they looked away. Samuel ate 3 bites before the coughing started again, so violent that he dropped his bread. Clara grabbed him, holding him upright, feeling the convulsions rack his small body. Breathe, baby, she murmured. Just breathe. When the fit finally passed, Samuel slumped against her, exhausted. His forehead was even hotter than it had been during the night. Mama, Samuel's sick, Lizzie said unnecessarily. I know, sweetheart. Clara smoothed her son's hair back from his face. He needed medicine. Real medicine, not just home remedies. He needed a doctor. She had 3 pennies. The town doctor charged $2 for a house call. Clara looked down at her sick son, at the chunk of bread he'd dropped, and made another impossible calculation. If she spent her 3 pennies on medicine, even the cheapest kind, she'd have nothing left for anything else. But if Samuel got worse... Finish your breakfast, she told the other children. I need to think. She stepped outside, leaving them with the food, and tried to figure out what to do next. The mysterious sack had bought them time, but not much. They still needed shelter, real shelter, not this falling down death trap. They needed warmer clothes. Samuel needed medicine. Grace needed. Clara looked down at her baby, so light in her arms, so terribly light, and felt panic claw at her throat. Grace needed Clara to produce milk again, and that wouldn't happen until Clara herself had enough food and water and rest. It was an impossible problem with no solution. She was still standing there, frozen with indecision, when she heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching through snow. Clara spun around, instinctively putting herself between the approaching figure and the cabin door. Her hand found a piece of firewood, heavy enough to use as a weapon if needed. But the figure that emerged from the trees wasn't threatening. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a careful slowness that suggested he didn't want to startle her. He wore a heavy coat and a hat pulled low, and even from a distance Clara recognized him, the scarred man from the marketplace. He stopped about 20 feet away, well outside what Clara's desperate mind identified as attacking distance. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Clara gripped the firewood tighter. "What do you want?" His voice, when he spoke, was rough from disuse, like he didn't talk much and had to remember how. "Came to check on you." "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes moved past her to the cabin, taking in the collapsed roof, the missing windows, the general state of decay. Something flickered across his face. Anger, maybe, or disgust, though Clara couldn't tell if it was directed at her or the situation. "You left the food," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded once. "Why?" Clara asked again. "Heard what happened yesterday, in the marketplace." His gaze came back to her face. "Figured you could use some help." Clara wanted to be grateful. She was grateful. But exhaustion and desperation had scraped away her ability to be polite. "I don't need charity." His mouth twitched, might have been the beginning of a smile. "Yeah, you do." The blunt honesty of it, the complete lack of judgment in his voice, somehow made it worse. Clara felt tears burn behind her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of this stranger. She would not. "Thank you for the food," she said stiffly, "but we'll manage from here." "You're living in a death trap with 5 kids and no heat." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was commenting on the weather. "You won't last another night." "That's not your concern." "No," he agreed. "It's not." But he didn't leave. He just stood there, solid and immovable, like he had all the time in the world. Clara didn't know what to do with that. In her experience, men either tried to take advantage of desperate women or they looked the other way. They didn't just stand there, quietly offering help, with no apparent expectation of anything in return. "What do you want?" she asked for the 3rd time. This time, his answer was different. "To fix your roof." Clara blinked. "What?" "Roof's half collapsed. Won't make it through another snowfall." He gestured toward the cabin. "I can fix it. Take me a few hours." "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." "Then why would you?" "Because it needs fixing." He said it like that was the only reason necessary. Clara stared at this strange, scarred man who'd appeared out of nowhere with food and offers of help and no apparent ulterior motives, and felt something crack in her chest. It was too much. The kindness was too much. She'd been braced for cruelty, for indifference, for the world to keep kicking her while she was down. She didn't know how to handle someone actually trying to help. "I don't even know your name," she whispered. Rhett Callahan. I'm Clara Dawson. Clara Yachts. I know." At her startled look, he added, "Small town. People talk." Clara wondered what they said when they talked about her. Nothing good, probably. The widow with too many children, the woman who begged in the marketplace, the failure who couldn't even keep a roof over her family's head. "Mr. Callahan." "Just Rhett." "Rhett," she corrected. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't understand why you're doing this. You don't know us. We're nothing to you." For the first time, something shifted in his expression, something that might have been pain, old and deep and carefully hidden. Maybe that's exactly why. Before Clara could figure out what that meant, a small voice called from inside the cabin. "Mama? Mama, Samuel's coughing again." Clara spun around and rushed back inside, forgetting about Rhett, forgetting everything except her sick son. Samuel was doubled over, his whole body convulsing with coughs that brought up nothing but seemed to tear him apart from the inside. "I've got you, baby," Clara murmured, lifting him into her arms. "I've got you." But she didn't have him. She didn't have anything except empty hands and empty pockets and a crushing sense of helplessness. She didn't hear Rhett come inside, but suddenly he was there, kneeling beside them. How long has he been like this? 2 days, maybe 3. Clara couldn't remember anymore. Time had become meaningless, measured only in degrees of desperation. Rhett put a hand on Samuel's back, feeling the rattle of his breathing. His face went grim. He needs to see a doctor. I know that. Clara's voice came out sharper than she intended. I know, but the doctor costs money I don't have. Rhett was quiet for a moment, studying Samuel's flushed face. Then he stood up. Wait here. Where are you? But he was already gone, moving through the door with surprising speed for such a large man. Clara held Samuel close, rocking him gently while the other children clustered around. Maggie's hand found Clara's shoulder, a small anchor of comfort. Who is that man? Lizzie whispered. Someone trying to help, Clara said, though she still didn't understand why. Rhett was gone for 2 hours. Clara spent that time trying to keep Samuel comfortable, trying to keep the other children warm, trying not to think about what would happen if the stranger didn't come back. Maybe he'd changed his mind. Maybe he'd realized that helping them was more trouble than it was worth. Maybe. The door opened and Rhett filled the frame, his arms loaded with supplies. Wood, real chopped wood, enough to keep the fire going for days. A thick blanket, wool and new-looking. A basket containing more food, eggs, bacon, real coffee, even a small jar of honey, and a brown glass bottle that Clara recognized as medicine. Doc Mitchell made this up special, Rhett said, setting the bottle down carefully. For the cough. Said to give the boy a spoonful every 4 hours. Clara picked up the bottle with shaking hands. How much did this cost? Doesn't matter. It does to me. Rhett met her eyes, and for the first time, Clara saw past the scar and the hard expression to something that looked almost kind. Let it go. Just this once. Let someone help you. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to maintain her pride, wanted to prove that she could handle this herself. But Samuel chose that moment to cough again, weak and wet and terrible, and pride suddenly seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. Thank you, she whispered. Rhett nodded once, then started building up the fire with the wood he'd brought. Within minutes, real warmth began to fill the cabin. Not much, but enough to make the children stop shivering. Clara gave Samuel a spoonful of the medicine, watching anxiously as he swallowed it. He made a face at the bitter taste, but didn't fight her. Now, Rhett said, standing up and brushing off his hands. About that roof. He worked through the afternoon while Clara tended to the children. She could hear him up there, the sound of hammering echoing through the cold air, steady and sure. Occasionally she'd glance outside and see him, balanced on the broken rafters, his breath frosting in the air, working with the focused intensity of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. By the time the sun started to set, the roof was fixed. Not perfect, but solid. The cabin was warmer now, protected from the wind that had been slicing through the gaps. Rhett climbed down and came to the door, his face red from cold, but not looking particularly bothered by it. Should hold through the winter, he said. Long as we don't get any more heavy snow. We? Clara asked before she could stop herself. He looked at her for a long moment. You planning to stay here? I don't have anywhere else to go. Then yeah, we. He said it like it was simple, like it was already decided. I'll be back tomorrow. See what else needs fixing. Mr. Callahan, Rhett, you don't have to. I know. He settled his hat more firmly on his head. Get some rest, Mrs. Dawson. You look like you're about to fall over. He was gone before she could respond, disappearing into the twilight like he'd never been there at all. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him go, and felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been frozen and locked up and dead for months. It felt dangerously close to hope. She pushed it down ruthlessly. Hope was dangerous. Hope got you hurt. But that night, with the fire burning warm and Samuel sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, and actual food in their bellies, Clara found it harder to maintain her despair. The next morning, there was another sack on the porch. Fresh milk, bread, and a tin of tea. The morning after that, a bundle of firewood and a second blanket. The morning after that, tools. An axe, a hammer, nails. Each time, Rhett appeared sometime during the day, never explaining, never asking for thanks. He'd fix something, the door, the window frames, the gaps in the walls, work for a few hours, then disappear again. He barely spoke, never stayed for meals, never came inside when the children were awake. But Clara noticed things. The way he moved carefully around her, always maintaining distance, the way his eyes tracked her children with something that looked like longing, the way his hands trembled sometimes when he thought no one was watching. She noticed the scar on his face, the way it pulled at his jaw when he frowned. She noticed the other scars too, on his hands, disappearing under his sleeves, the kind that came from violence. She noticed that he never smiled, never relaxed, never seemed to believe that he deserved to be anywhere near anything good or pure or innocent. A week passed, then two. Samuel's cough improved. Grace started nursing again as Clara's body finally had enough resources to produce milk. The cabin became something almost livable, still poor, still barely adequate, but no longer a death sentence. And through it all, Rhett kept coming. Clara tried to talk to him, tried to understand why he was doing this, but he deflected every question with grunts or silence. The children, less inhibited, took to following him around when he worked. They'd sit in the snow and watch him with wide eyes, occasionally whispering to each other, but never quite brave enough to approach. It was Maggie who finally broke through. Clara was inside cooking soup, real soup, with vegetables and barley that Rhett had left, when she heard her daughter's voice outside. "Why do you help us?" Clara moved to the window, watching as Maggie stood in front of Rhett, her chin tilted up in determination. She'd inherited her father's stubbornness, and sometimes Clara didn't know whether to be proud or worried about it. Rhett had frozen, hammer in hand, staring at the small girl like she'd pulled a gun on him. "I mean, we're grateful," Maggie continued, her voice very serious. "But Mama says people don't help unless they want something. So what do you want?" Clara held her breath, waiting. Rhett set down the hammer very slowly. He was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer at all. Then, in a voice so low Clara could barely hear it, "I want you to be safe." "Why?" "Because—" He stopped, started again. "Because someone should. Someone should make sure you're safe." "But why you?" "Why not me?" Maggie considered this with the gravity of a much older person. "Mama thinks you're going to leave. She thinks everyone leaves." Rhett's jaw tightened. "Your mama's right to think that." "But you keep coming back." "Yeah, I do." "Will you always?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Clara pressed her hand against the window, her heart suddenly racing. "I don't know," Rhett said honestly. I'm not good at staying." "Papa wasn't good at staying either," Maggie said softly. "He left us. He didn't want to, but he did. I'm sorry." "Are you going to leave us too?" Rhett looked at this 9-year-old child who'd already lost so much, who was asking him questions he didn't know how to answer, and something in his face cracked open. "I'm going to try not to. That's good enough," Maggie decided. Then, with the swift decisiveness of childhood, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist. Rhett went rigid, his hands hovering in the air like he didn't know what to do with them. Clara saw panic flash across his face, saw him start to pull away. Then slowly, carefully, like he was handling something infinitely precious and breakable, he lowered his hands to rest gently on Maggie's back. Clara turned away from the window, tears streaming down her face, and tried to remember how to breathe. That night, for the first time since Thomas died, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, they were going to survive this after all. But she didn't know that the hardest test was still coming. She didn't know that in 3 days, the worst blizzard in 50 years would descend on Ash Hollow, cutting them off from town completely. And she didn't know that Rhett Callahan was about to risk everything, his life, his past, his carefully maintained distance from the world, to make sure her children never went hungry again. The sky changed on the 3rd day after Maggie hugged Rhett. Clara noticed it first thing in the morning when she stepped outside to collect water from the creek. The color had shifted from the usual winter gray to something darker, heavier, almost greenish at the edges. The air felt different too, thick and expectant, like the whole world was holding its breath. She'd lived in Wyoming long enough to recognize the signs. "Storm's coming," Rhett said from behind her, making her jump. She hadn't heard him approach, but then she never did. He moved like smoke, like something that existed between the solid world and somewhere else entirely. Clara turned to face him. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd grown almost accustomed to his presence, to the way he appeared each morning with supplies and disappeared each evening without explanation. The children had started calling him Mr. Proctor. Rhett, and even Samuel, still weak from his illness, brightened when he heard the familiar footsteps on the porch. "How bad?" she asked. Rhett studied the sky with the attention of someone who'd learned to read weather the way other men read books. "Bad. Real bad. Town's already preparing. Saw them boarding up windows when I came through this morning." Clara's stomach dropped. "How long do we have?" "Day, maybe 2 if we're lucky." His eyes moved from the sky to the cabin, and she could see him calculating, measuring, planning. "We need more wood. A lot more. And food. Enough to last a week at least." "A week? Storm like this, we could be snowed in that long, maybe longer." He was already moving toward the woodpile, his decision made. "I'll head into town, get what we need. You stay here. Keep the children inside." "Rhett, wait." Clara caught his arm without thinking, then immediately released it when she felt him tense under her touch. "You don't have to do this. You've already done so much, Mrs. Dawson." He turned to face her fully, and for once he didn't look away. "If I don't get supplies now, you and those kids won't make it through what's coming. So yeah, I do have to do this." There was something in his voice, something fierce and final, that made Clara's throat tight. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" Rhett was quiet for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. Then, so softly she almost didn't hear it, "Because nobody cared when I needed them to, long time ago. And I swore if I ever got the chance, I'd be different." Before Clara could respond, before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, striding away through the snow with that ground-eating pace that covered distance faster than seemed possible. Clara stood on the porch, watching him disappear into the tree line, and felt fear coil in her stomach. Not fear of the storm, though that was real enough. Fear that this strange, scarred man who'd appointed himself their guardian was going to do something reckless, something dangerous, something that would cost him more than he could afford. "Mama?" Lizzie appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Where's Mr. Rhett going?" "Into town, sweetheart, to get supplies." "Is the storm really bad?" Clara looked at her daughter's anxious face and made a choice. The children had been through enough. They didn't need to carry her fears too. "Mr. Rhett will take care of us. He always does." But as she herded the children back inside and started rationing what food they had left, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. Rhett reached Ash Hollow just as the first snowflakes began to fall. The town was in chaos, every able-bodied person rushing to prepare for what everyone now agreed was going to be the storm of the decade, maybe the storm of the century. The old-timers were already telling stories about the blizzard of '71, when the snow had piled 12 feet high and 3 families had frozen to death in their homes. Rhett ignored the activity, focused entirely on his mission. He needed food, blankets, medicine, everything Clara and the children would need to survive a week or more of being completely cut off from town. He also needed money, and he didn't have nearly enough. His first stop was the general store, where Mr. Henderson was frantically trying to serve a dozen customers at once. Flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork. Rhett reeled off his list, watching Henderson's eyes widen. "That's a lot of supplies, Callahan. Stocking up for the winter?" "Something like that. How much?" Henderson did the calculation, his lips moving silently. $15, give or take. Rhett had $8.30. He'd been saving it for months. Every penny he could spare from his work at the forge and the odd jobs he picked up around town. It wasn't enough. "I'll take what $8 will buy," he said evenly. Henderson frowned. "That won't get you half of what you asked for. Then I'll come back for the rest." "Callahan, that storm's going to hit tonight. Maybe tomorrow morning at the latest. You won't have time to come back." Rhett knew that. He also knew he had no choice. "Just give me what I can afford." He left the general store with 2 bags of supplies that felt pathetically inadequate. Flour, some dried beans, a small tin of coffee. Not nearly enough. Not even close to enough. His next stop was the butcher shop, where Henry Walsh was in the process of closing up early. "Need meat," Rhett said without preamble. "Whatever you can spare." Walsh looked up, and something shifted in his expression when he recognized Rhett. Heard you've been helping the Dawson woman. That true? Rhett's jaw tightened. Of course people were talking. They always did in small towns. That's my business. Just asking. Walsh returned to packing away his inventory. Seems like a lot of effort for someone else's family. You going to sell me meat or not? Walsh studied him for a moment, then shrugged. Sure. What do you want? Whatever $3 will buy. It bought less than Rhett had hoped. Some salt pork, a few pounds of venison, some bones for soup. Walsh wrapped it in brown paper without comment, but Rhett could feel the man's judgment like a physical weight. By the time he left the butcher shop, Rhett had spent $11 and had supplies that might last Clara's family 4 days if they were careful. It wasn't enough. The storm was going to last longer than 4 days. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the wind was already picking up, in the way the temperature was dropping with each passing minute. He needed more money. Rhett stood in the middle of the street, snow falling harder now, and took inventory of what he had left. The clothes on his back, not worth selling. His knife, he needed that. His gun, he needed that more. His hand went to his pocket, feeling the shape of the pocket watch there. It had been his brother's. James had carried it through 4 years of war, had kept it wound and running even when everything else was falling apart. When James died at Shiloh, Rhett had taken the watch from his brother's cooling body and carried it ever since. 14 years. Through battles and hospitals and the long dark years after the war when Rhett had wandered the frontier trying to outrun his ghosts. It was the only thing he owned that mattered. His fingers closed around it, feeling the familiar weight, the smooth gold case engraved with initials that weren't his. Then he pulled it out and looked at it for a long moment, memory flooding back. James laughing, James teaching him to fish, James stepping in front of a bullet meant for Rhett and dying before he hit the ground. I'm sorry, Rhett whispered to his dead brother, but they need it more than I do. The pawn shop was run by a man named Morris Keene, who had the look of someone who'd spent his whole life taking advantage of other people's desperation. He brightened when Rhett walked in, recognizing a desperate man when he saw one. Mr. Callahan, what can I do for you? Rhett set the watch on the counter. How much? Keene picked it up, examining it with practiced eyes. Gold case, decent mechanism. I can give you $6. It's worth 20 and you know it. Maybe in a big city. Here? Keene shrugged. $6. Take it or leave it. Rhett wanted to grab the man by his collar and shake him until his teeth rattled. But that wouldn't help Clara's children, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Fine. $6. Keene counted out the money with exaggerated slowness, while Rhett watched his brother's watch disappear into the man's greedy hands. It felt like losing James all over again. But $6 bought more flour, more beans, another blanket, and a jar of honey that would help the children through the worst of it. Rhett was loading the supplies onto his horse when he saw something in the window of the dry goods store. A small wooden bird carved and painted, the kind of toy a child might love. It cost 50 cents. He had 75 cents left. He bought it without thinking, tucking it carefully into his coat pocket. The snow was falling thick and fast now, visibility dropping with each passing minute. The wind had picked up too, howling between buildings, turning the flakes into stinging needles of ice. Around him, people were rushing for shelter, abandoning their preparations, recognizing that the storm had arrived earlier than expected. Rhett tied the supply bags to his saddle and swung up onto his horse. The gelding was nervous, tossing its head, sensing the storm's fury building in the air. Easy, Red, Rhett murmured, patting the horse's neck. Just got to get home. But as he turned the horse toward the edge of town, toward the path that would take him back to Clara and the children, the full force of the blizzard hit. The world disappeared. One moment, Rhett could see the buildings of Ash Hollow, the street, the path ahead. The next, there was nothing but white. A wall of snow so thick and disorienting that he couldn't tell which direction was which. The wind screamed, tearing at his coat, his hat, trying to rip him from the saddle. Red whinnied in fear, rearing slightly. Steady, Rhett said, but his voice was lost in the wind. He knew the path back to the cabin. He'd walked it dozens of times over the past 2 weeks. But in this whiteout, every direction looked the same. One wrong turn and he could wander in circles until he froze to death. Or worse, until Red collapsed and he had to continue on foot. But he had the supplies. Clara's children needed these supplies. They wouldn't survive without them. Rhett touched his heels to Red's sides, trusting the horse's instincts more than his own eyes, and rode into the storm. Time became meaningless in the blizzard. Rhett had no idea if he'd been riding for minutes or hours. The cold was so intense it had moved past pain into something else, something that made his thoughts slow and sluggish. His hands were numb on the reins. His face felt like it had been carved from ice. Red was struggling, pushing through drifts that were already knee-deep and getting deeper. The horse's breath came in labored gasps, frost forming on its muzzle. "Come on, boy," Rhett urged. "Just a little further." But he had no idea if they were even going in the right direction anymore. The world was nothing but white noise and stinging snow and cold that ate through his clothes like acid. Then Red stumbled. The horse caught itself, but Rhett felt the tremor in the animal's legs, felt the exhaustion that was rapidly overtaking the gelding. They couldn't go much further. Red was going to collapse, and when he did, they'd both die out here. Rhett made a decision. He dismounted, his legs nearly giving out when they hit the ground, and started unbuckling the supply bags from the saddle. "Go on," he told Red, slapping the horse's flank. "Get to shelter." Red didn't need to be told twice. The horse turned and disappeared into the white, hopefully heading back to town in the warm stable Rhett rented. Rhett hefted the supply bags onto his shoulders. They were impossibly heavy, but he'd carried heavier things before. In the war, he'd carried wounded men through worse conditions than this. He'd marched 40 miles with a bullet in his leg. He'd survived things that should have killed him. He could do this. He had to do this. Because 5 children and their mother were waiting, and they were counting on him even if they didn't know it, and Rhett Callahan had failed to save people before, had watched them die while he stood helpless, and he would not, could not, fail again. So he walked. One step, then another, then another. The snow was above his knees now, each step a battle against drifts that wanted to swallow him whole. The bags on his shoulders felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. His lungs burned with each breath of frozen air. But he kept walking. He thought about James, about the promise he'd made to his dying brother. "Take care of yourself, Rhett. Find something worth living for." He thought about the war, about all the men he hadn't been able to save, all the faces that haunted his dreams. He thought about the boy at Chancellorsville, no more than 16, crying for his mother while he bled out in Rhett's arms. And he thought about Maggie, wrapping her small arms around his waist, trusting him with a faith he didn't deserve. "I'm going to try not to leave," he'd told her. Time to prove it. Rhett didn't know how long he walked, long enough that his legs stopped working properly, that he started to fall and have to force himself back up. Long enough that his body stopped shivering, which he knew, somewhere in the dim recesses of his mind, was a very bad sign. He fell again, hard, and this time getting up seemed impossible. The snow was so soft, so inviting. It would be easy to just lie here, to let the cold take him, to finally rest after so many years of running from his ghosts. But his hand, numb and clumsy, found something in his coat pocket. The wooden bird he'd bought, for Clara's youngest. For Grace, who was too young to remember this winter, but who deserved to grow up with toys and safety and a future. Rhett pulled himself up. One more step, then another, then another. He was so cold now that he'd stopped feeling his body entirely. He existed somewhere outside himself, watching from a distance as this stupid, stubborn man refused to die, refused to give up, refused to accept that maybe this time he'd finally bitten off more than he could chew. Then, through the wall of white, he saw it, a dim glow, barely visible but unmistakable, light from a window. The cabin. Rhett tried to call out, but his voice was gone, frozen in his throat. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. All he could manage was a stumbling forward momentum that was more falling than walking. The last thing he remembered was the door opening, warm air rushing out, and Clara's voice crying his name before the world tilted sideways and everything went dark. Clara had been watching the window for hours, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. The storm had hit with a violence that made the cabin shake on its foundations. Even with Rhett's repairs, the wind found every crack and crevice, whistling through with a sound like screaming. The children huddled by the fire, silent and scared, while Clara paced and watched and waited. He should have been back by now. The storm had started hours ago, and Rhett had left that morning. Even accounting for the trip to town and back, he should have been here, unless something had gone wrong. "Mama, sit down," Maggie said quietly. "You're making everyone nervous." Clara couldn't sit down. Every instinct she had was screaming that Rhett was in trouble, that he needed help, that she should be doing something instead of just standing here watching the storm devour the world outside. "He's fine," she told herself as much as the children. "He knows these mountains. He'll be fine." But she didn't believe it. When she saw movement through the window, a dark shape emerging from the white, Clara's heart leaped into her throat. She ran to the door and threw it open, not caring about the blast of Arctic air that rushed in. It was Rhett, but a Rhett she barely recognized. He was covered in ice, his face gray, his eyes unfocused. He took one step toward her, dropped the supply bags, and collapsed. "Rhett!" Clara caught him as he fell, his weight nearly pulling them both down. "Maggie, help me!" Together, Clara and her daughter dragged Rhett inside. He was so cold that touching him hurt, like pressing her hands against frozen metal. His lips were blue. His breathing was shallow and rapid. "Is he dead?" Samuel whispered, his eyes huge. "No," Clara said firmly, though she wasn't sure. "Lizzie, add wood to the fire. Maggie, get every blanket we have. Samuel, Michael, Thomas, stay back and stay quiet." She started pulling off Rhett's frozen coat, his gloves, his boots. His clothes were soaked through, ice forming in the fabric. She worked quickly, efficiently, the way she'd learned during Thomas's illness, pushing down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. When she got his shirt off, she saw the scars. They covered his torso like a map of violence, old bullet wounds, knife marks, what looked like whip scars across his back. Clara's hands trembled as she looked at them, understanding for the first time just how much this man had survived, how much pain he carried. "The blankets, Mama," Maggie said, appearing at her elbow. Clara wrapped Rhett in every blanket they had, then pulled him closer to the fire. His skin was like ice, his body racked with shivers so violent they looked like convulsions. "Will he be okay?" Maggie asked softly. "I don't know, sweetheart. I don't know." But Clara wasn't going to let him die. Not after everything he'd done for them. Not after he'd nearly killed himself bringing them supplies. Not after he'd proven, again and again, that he was the kind of man who kept his promises even when it cost him everything. She pulled Rhett's head into her lap, using her own body heat to warm him. His face was so cold it burned her hands. His breathing was getting worse, more labored. "Don't you dare," Clara whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare die on us, Rhett Callahan. We need you. Do you hear me? We need you." The hours that followed were the longest of Clara's life. She held Rhett through the night, feeling each shallow breath, each racing heartbeat, waiting to see if he would slip away or fight his way back. The children took turns keeping the fire going, bringing water, staying quiet when Clara needed silence to hear Rhett's breathing. Maggie found the supply bags by the door and quietly started unpacking them. Flour, beans, meat, blankets, medicine. So much more than they'd had. More than Clara had thought possible. At the bottom of one bag, wrapped carefully in cloth, was the wooden bird. Maggie brought it to her mother, her eyes shining with tears. "He bought this for Grace, didn't he?" Clara took the small carved bird, feeling the smooth wood, seeing the care that had gone into painting its tiny feathers. Rhett had bought this with money he didn't have, had carried it through a blizzard that nearly killed him, had thought about making her baby smile even while he was freezing to death. "Yes," Clara whispered. "He did." She looked down at Rhett's gray face, at the scar that ran down his cheek, at the man who'd walked into their lives without explanation and decided to save them for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. And she made a decision. "You're going to live," she told him, her voice fierce and certain, "because I'm not going to let you die. Because you chose us, and now we're choosing you. You hear me, Rhett? You belong to us now. You're not allowed to leave." She didn't know if he could hear her. She didn't know if it would make any difference, but she said it anyway, a promise and a prayer, and a demand all rolled into one. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the world in white. Inside, Clara held a dying man in her arms and refused to let go. Dawn came eventually, though Clara barely noticed. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, all her attention was focused on the man whose head rested in her lap. His breathing had steadied some time during the long night, the terrible rasping replaced by something slower, deeper. His skin had lost that deathly gray color, warming to something closer to normal. The violent shivering had subsided into occasional tremors. He was alive. For now. Clara's back ached from sitting in the same position for hours. Her legs had gone numb beneath Rhett's weight. But she didn't move, didn't shift, terrified that any change might tip him back toward death. "Mama?" Maggie's soft voice came from beside the fire. "You should eat something." "I'm fine, sweetheart." "You're not." Maggie brought over a cup of the broth she'd made from the supplies Rhett had brought, kneeling beside her mother. "Please, Mama, you can't take care of him if you don't take care of yourself." The logic was sound, even if Clara's heart resisted leaving Rhett's side. She took the cup with her free hand, sipping the warm liquid. It was thin. Maggie had stretched what they had, uncertain how long the storm would last. But it was hot and real and exactly what Clara needed. "Thank you, baby." Maggie settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Is Mr. Rhett going to be okay?" "I think so. His fever broke an hour ago." Clara hadn't mentioned the fever to the children, hadn't wanted to scare them more than they already were. But sometime around midnight, Rhett's temperature had spiked dangerously high. Clara had spent 2 hours bathing his face with cool water, whispering prayers and promises and threats, until finally the fever had broken and left him sleeping peacefully. "He came back," Maggie said quietly, "even though it was dangerous, even though he could have died." "Yes, he did." That means he cares about us, doesn't it?" Clara looked down at Rhett's face, peaceful now, in sleep, younger somehow without the weight of consciousness. "Yes, sweetheart, I think it does." "Do you think he'll stay? When he wakes up, I mean. Do you think he'll want to stay with us?" It was the question Clara had been avoiding asking herself, because the truth was, she didn't know. Rhett had proven he would risk his life to keep them safe, but that didn't mean he wanted to be part of their family. He was a loner, a man who kept his distance, who never talked about his past or his plans. For all Clara knew, once he recovered, he'd disappear back into whatever shadows he'd emerged from. The thought made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with Thomas's memory. "I don't know," Clara said honestly, "but I hope he does." Maggie nodded solemnly, then rested her head on Clara's shoulder. "Me too, Mama. Me too." The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of howling wind and snow that piled against the cabin walls until they were nearly buried. 3 days of rationing food and keeping the fire burning and taking turns watching over Rhett as he drifted in and out of feverish sleep. On the second day, he woke briefly, his eyes unfocused and confused. "Easy," Clara murmured, her hand on his chest to keep him from trying to sit up. "You're safe. You're in the cabin. The supplies—" His voice was rough, barely audible. "We have them. You brought them all. Everything we need." She brought water to his lips, supporting his head as he drank. "Now rest. You need to heal. The children are fine, thanks to you." Claire's voice cracked despite her efforts to keep it steady. "You saved us, Rhett. All of us." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Then he closed them again and fell back into sleep. Clara sat back, her hand still resting on his chest, where she could feel the steady beat of his heart, and allowed herself to cry. Quiet tears that she wiped away before the children could see, tears of relief and exhaustion, and something else she wasn't ready to name. By the third day, Rhett was awake more than asleep, though still too weak to do more than lie by the fire and watch the children with those intense, careful eyes. Clara made him soup from the supplies he'd brought, rich broth with actual vegetables and meat, and watched him eat with a focus that seemed almost religious. "You don't have to stare at me," he said, the first full sentence he'd managed since collapsing. "I'm making sure you actually eat it." Clara sat down beside him, adjusting the blankets that were piled on top of him. "You're worse than the children. At least they don't try to give their portions away." Rhett's mouth twitched, might have been the beginning of a smile. "How long was I out?" 2.5 days. Clara kept her voice matter-of-fact, not letting him hear the terror those days had held. You nearly died, Rhett. Your body temperature was so low I couldn't find your pulse at first. But I didn't die. Because I wouldn't let you. The words came out fiercer than she'd intended. Because you don't get to risk your life for us and then just give up. Rhett studied her face, seeing something there that made his expression soften. I wasn't trying to give up. I was trying to get back to you. The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning Clara wasn't sure she was ready to examine. She stood up quickly, needing distance, needing to move. Well, you did, so now you need to focus on healing. Clara. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his rough voice did something strange to her heartbeat. She turned back to face him. Thank you, Rhett said quietly, for taking care of me. I know it wasn't easy with the storm and the children, and you carried supplies through a blizzard that nearly killed you, Clara interrupted. Taking care of you while you recovered is the absolute least I could do. Don't thank me for basic human decency, Rhett Callahan. This time he did smile, just a small quirk of his scarred mouth, but it transformed his whole face. Clara felt her breath catch, seeing for the first time what this man might look like if he ever allowed himself to be truly happy. Yes, ma'am, he said, and there was something in his tone that might have been affection. On the fourth day, the storm finally broke. Clara woke to silence, the kind of deep, profound silence that only comes after days of relentless wind. She carefully extracted herself from the pile of children sleeping around her and went to the window. The world outside was transformed. Snow had buried everything, creating an alien landscape of smooth white curves and strange shapes. The cabin itself was half buried, snow piled almost to the roof on the windward side. The trees were weighted down, their branches hanging low under the burden of ice. It was beautiful and terrible and completely impassable. We're snowed in, Rhett's voice came from behind her. Clara turned to find him sitting up, still wrapped in blankets but looking stronger than he had since he'd collapsed. How long do you think? Week, maybe more. Depends on when the thaw starts. He looked around the cabin, taking inventory with the same careful attention he gave everything. How's our food supply? If we're careful, we have enough for about 10 days. Clara had been counting and recounting, trying different rationing scenarios in her head. We'll be hungry, but we'll survive. Good. Rhett started to stand up, then wavered. Clara was at his side immediately, her arm around his waist to steady him. What do you think you're doing? Need to check the roof. Make sure the weight of the snow hasn't compromised it. You can barely stand. The roof can wait. Clara, sit down. She used the same voice she used on the children when they were being particularly stubborn, and to her surprise, Rhett actually listened. He sat back down, though she could see the frustration in every line of his body. I'm not used to being useless, he muttered. You're not useless. You're recovering from nearly freezing to death. Clara sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The cabin survived 3 days of storm. It'll survive another few hours while you rest. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the dawn light filter through the window and paint strange shadows on the snow-covered landscape. Tell me something, Clara said quietly, not looking at him. Why did you really come back? You could have stayed in town, waited out the storm where it was safe. Why risk your life? Rhett was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. Then, in a voice that sounded like it was being dragged out of him against his will, I made a promise. To who? To myself, a long time ago. He stared at his hands, scarred and rough and strong. I had a brother, James. He was older, better, everything I should have been. When the war came, he enlisted. I followed because that's what you did. You followed your brother into hell and hoped you both made it back out. Clara waited, sensing that this was a story Rhett had never told anyone, that speaking it aloud was costing him something precious. We ended up at Chancellorsville, Rhett continued, his voice flat and distant. May of '63. I was 22 years old and thought I understood what war meant. I was wrong. He paused, swallowed hard. There was a boy in our unit, Eddie Fletcher, barely 16, lied about his age to enlist. He was scared all the time, but he tried to hide it. James took him under his wing, looked after him. Rhett's hands tightened into fists. During the battle, we got separated from our unit. Just the three of us, me, James, and Eddie. The Rebs were everywhere, and Eddie got shot, gut shot. The kind where you know there's no surviving, but it takes forever to die. Clara's hand found Rhett's, covering his clenched fist with her palm. James tried to carry him, Rhett said, his voice breaking. Tried to get him to safety, but the Rebs were closing in, and I knew if we didn't leave him, we'd all die. So I told James we had to go. I pulled him away while Eddie was screaming for his mother, begging us not to leave him. Rhett, James took a bullet meant for me. While we were running, just stepped in front of me like it was the most natural thing in the world. He died in my arms, and the last thing he said was, "Take care of yourself. Find something worth living for." Rhett looked at Clara finally, and she saw tears tracking down his scarred face. I left that boy to die alone. I let my brother sacrifice himself, and I've spent 14 years trying to figure out how to live with that. Clara understood now. The distance, the isolation, the way Rhett never seemed to believe he deserved anything good. He'd been punishing himself for 14 years, carrying guilt that was slowly crushing him. "It wasn't your fault," she said quietly. "Yes, it was." "No." Clara turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "You were in an impossible situation. You made the only choice that gave anyone a chance to survive. That's not cowardice, Rhett. That's survival." "I left him. You were 22 years old in the middle of a battlefield." Clara's voice rose, startling them both. "You did what you had to do, and your brother, James, he chose to save you. That was his choice, not your fault." Rhett shook his head, not accepting it, probably never able to accept it. "Listen to me," Clara said fiercely. "You can't save everyone. I know that better than anyone. I couldn't save Thomas. I couldn't keep our ranch or pay our debts or protect my children from hunger. But you know what I did save? Them. All 5 of them. They're alive because I kept trying even when everything was falling apart." She squeezed his hands, feeling the calluses and scars, the evidence of a hard life lived honestly. "And they're alive right now because you walked through a blizzard that should have killed you. You gave them a future, Rhett. That has to count for something." "It does," he whispered, "more than you know." They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, sharing a silence that felt like healing. Then Maggie's voice came from the pile of sleeping children. "Mama, is Mr. Rhett okay?" Clara turned to find all 5 children awake, watching them with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. She thought they were still asleep, but clearly they'd been listening. Heat flooded her cheeks, but Rhett just smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "I'm okay, Maggie," he said. "Your mama took good care of me." Maggie scrambled out from under the blankets and crossed the cabin to throw her arms around Rhett's neck. "I was scared you were going to die, like Papa did." Rhett's arms came up to hold her carefully, like she was made of glass. "I'm not going anywhere, little bit. I promise." "You can't promise that," Maggie said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Papa promised too, and he still left." Clara's heart broke all over again, seeing her daughter's carefully hidden fear finally voiced. Rhett met Clara's eyes over Maggie's head, and she saw him understand what was being asked of him, the weight of the promise Maggie needed. "You're right," Rhett said slowly. "I can't promise I'll live forever. Nobody can. But I can promise this. I won't leave you by choice. Whatever happens, whatever I face, I'll fight to come back to you. All of you. That's a promise I can keep." Maggie pulled back, studying his face with 9-year-old intensity. "Really? Really?" She nodded, satisfied in the way only children can be, and returned to her siblings. Within minutes, they were all clustered around Rhett, asking questions and telling stories and simply being near him. Clara watched them, her heart so full it hurt. This strange, broken man had become the center of her children's world without either of them quite noticing when it happened. They trusted him completely, loved him without reservation, needed him in a way that terrified Clara because she knew how fragile everything was. But for the first time since Thomas died, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Rhett was stronger each day, though Clara caught him wincing when he thought no one was watching, his body still recovering from its brush with death. He insisted on checking the cabin's structure, on rationing the food supplies, on making plans for when the snow finally melted enough for them to move around. The children followed him everywhere, chattering away about everything and nothing. Even shy Samuel, who'd barely spoken since Thomas died, started talking again, asking Rhett questions about horses and weather and what the war had been like, though that last one Rhett deflected gently but firmly. Clara found herself watching them all with something that felt dangerously close to contentment. She'd cook what little food they had, stretching every ingredient as far as it would go, and listen to Rhett's low voice telling the children stories, edited versions of his travels, she suspected, with all the darkness removed. "Tell us about the mountains," Lizzie would beg. "Tell us about Texas," the twins would chorus. "Tell us about the time you met a bear," Samuel would add, even though they'd heard that story 3 times already. And Rhett would tell them, his voice patient and warm, giving them the gift of his attention in a way that made Clara's throat tight. On the 6th day of being snowed in, Clara was washing their few dishes when Rhett appeared at her elbow. "Let me help." "You should be resting." "I've been resting for almost a week. I'm going to go crazy if I don't do something useful." He picked up a dish without waiting for permission, drying it with practiced efficiency. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Rhett spoke again. "I've been thinking." "About?" "About what happens when the snow melts." He set down the dish, turning to face her. "You can't stay here, Clara. This cabin isn't fit for a family long term. The roof leaks, the walls are thin. There's no real insulation." "I know all that," Clara interrupted. "But I don't have anywhere else to go. No money, no prospects, and no one in this town who wants to help a widow with 5 children." "That's not entirely true." Clara looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Rhett took a breath, like he was gathering courage for something difficult. "There's a homestead about 10 miles north of here. Good land, solid cabin, barn that just needs some repairs. It's been abandoned for 2 years since the owner died." "So?" "So anyone who's willing to work it can file a claim. Prove up the land, make it official." His eyes met hers, intense and serious. "We could do that. You and me. Together." Clara's heart stuttered. "Rhett, I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. We could be partners, business partners. You need a home. I need a reason to stay in one place. We could help each other." "Why would you do that?" Clara whispered. "Because Rhett's jaw worked, wrestling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "Because I care about you, about the kids. Because somewhere along the way you all became the thing my brother told me to find, the thing worth living for." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "I don't have anything to offer you. No money. No, I don't want your money." Rhett's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I just want to help you build a life. For you and your kids. Let me do that, please." It was the please that undid her. This strong, stoic man who'd nearly died saving them, asking permission to be part of their lives. "Yes," Clara whispered. "Yes. Okay. We'll try." The smile that broke across Rhett's face was like sunrise, warm and bright and full of hope. But their fragile peace shattered 2 days later when someone knocked on the cabin door. Clara and Rhett exchanged confused glances. Who would be traveling in these conditions? The snow was still too deep for easy movement, the temperature still dangerous. Rhett moved to the door, his body instinctively positioning itself between Clara's family and whatever threat might wait outside. When he opened it, 3 men stood on the porch, bundled against the cold but radiating menace that had nothing to do with the weather. "Well, well," the man in front said, his smile showing too many teeth. "Heard Thomas Dawson's widow was hiding out here. Glad we finally tracked you down, Mrs. Dawson." Clara's blood ran cold. She recognized the voice, if not the face. Luther Kane, one of Thomas's creditors. The man who'd been most vicious in demanding payment, who'd threatened her repeatedly after Thomas died. "What do you want?" Clara asked, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "Just what's owed to me, ma'am. Your husband borrowed $300. I'm here to collect. I don't have $300. I don't have anything. Kane's smile widened. Well now, that's a problem, isn't it? But lucky for you, I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to accept alternative payment. His eyes moved over Clara in a way that made her skin crawl, then landed on the children huddled behind her. I hear there are families looking to adopt, Kane continued, willing to pay good money for strong boys who can work. Girls, too, if they're young enough to train properly. Clara's world tilted. You're not taking my children. I don't think you're in a position to argue, Mrs. Dawson. Kane took a step forward and found Rhett's hand on his chest, stopping him cold. That's far enough, Rhett said quietly. Kane looked him up and down, taking in the scars, the hard expression, the absolute stillness that preceded violence. This doesn't concern you, friend. Wrong. Everything that concerns Mrs. Dawson concerns me. You her husband? I'm the man telling you to leave. That's all you need to know. Kane's two companions shifted, hands moving toward weapons. The tension in the cabin ratcheted up to something sharp and deadly. Papa? Samuel's small voice came from behind Clara. Papa, I'm scared. Everyone froze. Samuel was looking at Rhett, his small face pale but trusting, using the word that none of the children had spoken since Thomas died. Rhett's expression went very still. Then he looked at Kane, and Clara saw something in his eyes that she'd never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous. You have 5 seconds to get off this porch, Rhett said softly. 5 seconds before I do something we'll all regret. You threatening me? I'm making a promise. The moment stretched thin and dangerous, like ice ready to crack. Kane's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, but before he could clear leather, Rhett moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man who'd been near death just days ago. His own gun appeared in his hand so fast Clara didn't even see him draw, the barrel leveled directly at Kane's chest. Don't, Rhett said, and the single word carried the weight of every violent thing he'd survived, every battle he'd fought, every man he'd killed to stay alive. Kane froze, his fingers still hovering near his weapon. Behind him, his two companions had their hands on their guns but hadn't drawn, clearly calculating whether this was worth dying over. You think you can protect them? Kane's voice was still cocky, but Clara heard the uncertainty underneath. You're one man against half the town. Thomas Dawson owed a lot of people money. We all got claims to settle. Then you can settle them with me. Rhett's gun didn't waver. The debt is mine now. You want your $300? You come to me and we'll work something out. But you don't come near Mrs. Dawson or her children again. Ever. Why the hell would you take on another man's debts? Because they're my family now. Rhett said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And I protect what's mine. Behind Clara, she heard Maggie's sharp intake of breath, felt the children pressing closer to her. Samuel's hand found hers, small and trusting, and Clara squeezed it gently while keeping her eyes on the confrontation at the door. Kane studied Rhett for a long moment, weighing his options. Whatever he saw in Rhett's face, the scars, the steady gun hand, the absolute certainty that he would pull the trigger without hesitation, must have convinced him. He stepped back slowly, hands rising to show he wasn't going for his weapon. Fine. We'll talk terms later. Kane's eyes slid past Rhett to Clara, still filled with malice. But make no mistake, Dawson, one way or another, debts get paid. The name's Callahan now, Clara heard herself say, her voice stronger than she felt. Mrs. Clara Callahan. The words hung in the air, shocking everyone, including Rhett, whose eyes widened fractionally. But Clara kept her gaze locked on Kane, letting him see that she wasn't alone anymore, wasn't vulnerable anymore, wasn't someone he could threaten and intimidate. Kane's mouth twisted into something ugly. That's so. You work fast for a grieving widow. And you work like a vulture, preying on families who've lost everything. Clara took a step forward, surprising herself with her own boldness. Thomas is dead. I've mourned him. And now I'm doing what I have to do to keep my children safe. If that offends your sense of propriety, Mr. Kane, I find I don't care. For a moment, she thought Kane might push it, might say something that would force Rhett to pull the trigger. But then he just laughed, harsh and mean. Fair enough. You want to play house with this scarred-up drifter, that's your business. He backed away from the door, his companions following. But $300 plus interest, Callahan. You got 2 weeks to come up with it, or we start taking what we're owed. And I promise you, we're not as nice as you think we are. They disappeared into the snow, and Rhett slowly lowered his gun, but didn't holster it until they were completely out of sight. Then he closed the door and turned to face Clara, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Callahan?" he asked quietly. Clara felt heat flood her cheeks, suddenly uncertain. In the moment, claiming his name had felt like the right move, a way to show Kane they weren't helpless. But now, looking at Rhett's carefully neutral face, she wondered if she'd overstepped, if she'd assumed too much. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have. I just thought if they believed we were married, they might back off." "Clara," or Rhett crossed the distance between them, his hands settling gently on her shoulders. "Breathe." She realized she was babbling, words tumbling out in a rush of anxiety and embarrassment. She forced herself to stop, to meet his eyes. "I meant what I said to Kane," Rhett said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "About you being my family. About protecting what's mine, but that's only true if it's what you want." Clara's throat closed up. What did she want? A week ago, the answer would have been simple. Survival, food, shelter for her children, but somewhere in the days of caring for Rhett's broken body, of watching him smile at her children, of feeling safe for the first time in months, the answer had gotten more complicated. She wanted him to stay. She wanted to wake up knowing he'd be there. She wanted her children to have a father who chose them, who kept his promises, who loved them not because of blood, but because of something deeper and more real. She wanted Rhett. She started, but Samuel interrupted. "Are you really going to be our papa now?" They'd forgotten about the children, who were all watching with wide, hopeful eyes. Clara felt Rhett tense under her hands, saw the flash of panic cross his face. "Samuel, that's not—" Clara began. "I'd like that," Rhett said, cutting her off. He looked at Samuel, then at each of the other children in turn. "If your mama agrees, and if you all agree, I'd be honored to be your papa." "I agree," Lizzie said immediately. "Me too," the twins chorused. Maggie was quieter, more thoughtful. She crossed the cabin to stand in front of Rhett, studying him with that too-old wisdom that broke Clara's heart every time she saw it. "Do you promise not to leave?" Maggie asked. "Not like Papa Thomas did?" "I can't promise I won't die someday," Rhett said honestly, kneeling so he was at her level. "But I promise I'll fight with everything I have to stay alive. I'll do whatever it takes to come home to you, all of you." Maggie considered this, then nodded slowly. "Okay, you can be our papa." She threw her arms around his neck, and within seconds, all 5 children had piled on, hugging Rhett with the unconscious ferocity of kids who'd been given permission to love someone again. Clara watched them, tears streaming down her face, and felt something that had been frozen inside her for months finally thaw. This wasn't how she'd imagined her life going. She'd loved Thomas with her whole heart, had built dreams with him that had died when he did. But maybe that was okay. Maybe you could grieve the life you lost and still build something new from the ashes. Rhett's eyes met hers over the tangle of children, and she saw her own emotions reflected back, hope and fear and determination, and something that might eventually become love. But first they had to survive. They had 2 weeks to come up with $300 or face Kane's threats. And Clara had no idea how they were going to do it. That night, after the children had finally fallen asleep, Clara and Rhett sat by the fire and faced the impossible problem. $300, Clara said quietly, plus interest, which probably means closer to $400. How? Rhett was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I have some money saved, maybe $50. It's not enough, but it's a start." "I have nothing, less than nothing. The only thing of value I own is—" Clara's hand went to the string around her neck, feeling the shape of her wedding ring through the fabric of her dress. "No," Rhett said immediately, understanding what she was thinking. "You're not selling that. It might be worth $100, maybe more if we can find the right buyer. Clara, that's the last piece of your husband you have, the last connection to a life that's over. Clara pulled the ring out, holding it up so it caught the firelight. It was simple gold, worn thin in places from years of wear. Thomas had been so proud when he'd bought it, had saved for months to afford it. Thomas gave me this ring as a promise of safety and security and a future for our family. He's gone, and that promise died with him. You don't mean that. I do. Clara looked at Rhett, willing him to understand. Thomas loved me, and I loved him. That love was real, and it mattered. But holding onto this ring won't bring him back or change what happened. My children are alive and real and right here. If this ring can help keep them safe, then that's what Thomas would have wanted. Rhett reached out, closing his hand gently around hers and the ring. You're sure? I'm sure. Then we'll do it together, my savings, your ring, and whatever else we can scrape together. And if it's not enough? He paused, his jaw tightening. If it's not enough, we'll figure something else out. Clara heard what he wasn't saying, that he'd do whatever it took, legal or otherwise, to protect them. The knowledge should have scared her. Instead, it made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in years. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For choosing us. You could have walked away so many times, but you stayed. Rhett's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. Wasn't really a choice. From the moment I saw you in that marketplace, saw you trying so hard to keep your dignity while you begged for scraps to feed your kids, I was done for. That was only 3 weeks ago. Feels like longer. It did. Clara felt like she'd known Rhett for years instead of weeks, like he'd always been part of their lives. Maybe some people came into your world quietly, but others crashed in like storms and changed everything. Rhett was definitely a storm. The next morning, they packed up what little they had and prepared to make the trek into town. The snow had finally melted enough to make travel possible, though it would still be slow going. Rhett fashioned a sled from branches and rope, piling the children onto it so they wouldn't have to struggle through the deep drifts. This is fun, Thomas Jr. declared as Rhett pulled them along, his brother Michael nodding enthusiastic agreement. Easy for you to say, Rhett replied, but Clara heard the amusement in his voice. You're not the one doing the pulling. The journey that normally took 30 minutes stretched to nearly 2 hours. By the time they reached Ash Hollow, Clara's legs were shaking with exhaustion, and even Rhett's breath was coming hard. But they'd made it. The town was busy with people digging out from the storm, repairing damage, checking on neighbors. Several people stopped and stared as Rhett pulled the sled past with Clara walking beside him, the children waving cheerfully at everyone they passed. Clara could practically hear the gossip starting. The widow Dawson, with that strange scarred man, and her 5 children, looking entirely too comfortable together. By nightfall, every person in Ash Hollow would know she'd taken up with Rhett Callahan. Let them talk. Clara had stopped caring what people thought somewhere around the time they'd watched her beg for food and done nothing. Their first stop was the bank, where Mr. Henry Morrison sat behind his imposing desk and looked at them with barely concealed distaste. Mrs. Dawson, Mr. Callahan, what can I do for you? We need to discuss my late husband's debts, Clara said, keeping her voice steady. Specifically the loan from Luther Kane. Morrison's eyebrows rose. That's between you and Mr. Kane. The bank has no involvement in private loans. But the bank does keep records. We need to know exactly how much Thomas borrowed and what the original terms were. I'm not sure that information is Mr. Morrison. Rhett leaned forward slightly, not threatening but definitely imposing. Mrs. Dawson has a right to know what she's being asked to pay. Unless you're suggesting Kane's claims might not be entirely legitimate? Morrison's face flushed. I'm suggesting no such thing. I simply... Very well. Give me a moment. He disappeared into the back room, returning with a ledger that he opened with obvious reluctance. Thomas Dawson borrowed $200 from Luther Kane 18 months ago. Terms were repayment within 1 year at 10% interest. 200, not 300? Claire asked sharply. That's what the record shows, though with the missed payments and accumulated interest, the current amount owed would be approximately $250. Not 300, not 400. Kane had been inflating the debt, betting that a desperate widow wouldn't know enough to check. Rage flowed through Clara, hot and clean. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. That's very helpful. Outside the bank, Rhett took her hand. We can do this. 250 is a lot, but it's not impossible. Their next stop was the jeweler, a thin man named Goldman who examined Clara's wedding ring with a practiced eye. Simple gold band, decent quality. He set it on the scales, checking the weight. I can give you $75. It's worth more than that, Clara protested. To you, maybe. To me, it's just gold. 75 is my final offer. Clara looked at the ring one last time, remembering the day Thomas had slipped it onto her finger, the promises they'd made to each other. Then she nodded. All right, 75. Goldman counted out the money and Clara took it, feeling strangely light. Letting go hurt less than she'd expected. Maybe because Thomas's real legacy wasn't in the ring. It was in their children, in the memories they shared, in the lessons he'd taught her about love and family. With Rhett's $50 and the 75 from the ring, they had 125. They needed another 125. There's one more thing I can sell, Rhett said quietly. What? He didn't answer, just led her to the stable where his horse was being kept. Red, the big gelding who'd carried Rhett through the blizzard before collapsing. The horse was recovered now, healthy and strong, worth real money to someone who needed reliable transportation. No, Clara said immediately. Rhett, no. Not your horse. It's just a horse. It's not just a horse. Red saved your life, and you'll need him for the homestead, for working the land. I'll get another horse. Rhett's hand ran along Red's neck, gentle and sad. Later, when we have money again. Right now, your kids need to be safe more than I need a horse. Clara wanted to argue, but she knew Rhett had already made up his mind. This was who he was, the man who would give up everything, sacrifice anything, to protect the people he'd claimed as family. The stable owner gave them $150 for Red, and just like that, they had enough. $275, more than enough to pay off Kane with a little left over. That afternoon, they found Kane in the saloon, drinking whiskey and laughing too loud with his friends. The conversation died when Rhett and Clara walked in, every eye in the place turning to watch. Kane, Rhett said, his voice carrying through the sudden silence. We need to talk. Kane stood up slowly, his smile predatory. Come to beg for more time? Come to pay what's actually owed. Rhett pulled out the money, counting it onto the table with deliberate precision. $200 principal, $50 interest. According to the bank records, that settles Thomas Dawson's debt in full. The smile slid off Kane's face. I told you $300. You lied. The bank has the original loan document, $200 at 10% interest. That's $250, and I'm paying you $250, even though Clara missed the deadline through no fault of her own. Rhett's voice dropped lower, dangerous. Consider the extra $25 a gift. Now give her the receipt showing the debt is paid. Kane's hands clenched into fists. You can't. Yes, I can. Either you take this money and sign a receipt, or I go to the sheriff and report that you're attempting to defraud a widow. Your choice. For a moment, Clara thought Kane might try something stupid. His face was red, his body tense with rage. But then one of his companions touched his arm, whispering something Clara couldn't hear, and Kane seemed to deflate. Fine. He snatched up the money, counting it twice before scrawling out a receipt. Debt paid in full. You and me are done, Mrs. Dawson. It's Mrs. Callahan now, Clara said, taking the receipt and folding it carefully. And yes, we're done. They walked out of the saloon together, and Clara felt like she could breathe for the first time in months. The debt that had hung over her head like an executioner's blade was gone. Her children were safe. They had a future. What now? She asked Rhett. Now we go file that homestead claim I told you about. Make it official. He looked down at her, and Clara saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. Unless you've changed your mind about having me around. I haven't changed my mind. Clara took his hand, lacing their fingers together. But there's one thing we need to do first. What's that? Get married. For real this time. Rhett stopped walking, staring at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language. Clara, I know it's fast. I know people will talk. But I don't care about any of that. Clara turned to face him fully, still holding his hand. You've proven yourself 1,000 times over. You've shown my children what it means to be a father, what it means to keep promises, and She took a breath, gathering courage. I'm not in love with you, not yet, but I could be. I think I already am, just a little. And that's enough to start with, isn't it? Rhett's scarred face worked through a dozen emotions: surprise, hope, fear, and something that looked almost like joy. You're sure? This isn't just because of the debt or because you need help with the homestead. I'm sure. Clara squeezed his hand. I'm choosing you, Rhett Callahan, the way you chose us. So what do you say? Want to make an honest woman out of me? The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, brilliant and warm and full of promise. Yeah, I do. They were married 3 days later by Pastor Williams, with all 5 children as witnesses, and half the town pretending they weren't craning their necks to watch through the church windows. Clara wore her best dress, still patched and worn but clean, and Rhett had shaved and trimmed his hair and looked almost respectable despite the scar. Do you, Clara Marie Dawson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Pastor Williams asked. I do, Clara said clearly, no hesitation. And do you, Rhett James Callahan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Rhett looked at Clara, at her children standing beside them, at the future they were about to build together. I do. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Rhett kissed her gently, carefully, like she was precious. When he pulled back, Clara saw tears in his eyes. Thank you, he whispered, for giving me a family, for giving me a reason. Thank you, Clara whispered back, for keeping us alive, for teaching us how to hope again. Behind them, the children cheered, and for the first time in longer than Clara could remember, she felt completely, perfectly happy. The homestead was everything Rhett had promised: good land, a solid cabin that needed work but was livable, a barn that just required some new boards. They moved in 2 weeks after the wedding, all 7 of them piling into the wagon Rhett had bought with the last of their money. The work was hard. Rhett spent his days repairing fences and clearing fields while Clara planted a garden and made the cabin into a real home. The children helped where they could, Maggie learning to cook, Samuel feeding the chickens they'd bought, the twins gathering firewood, Lizzie entertaining baby Grace while the adults worked. But every night they gathered around the table for dinner. Real dinner, with enough food that no one went to bed hungry. And after the children were asleep, Clara and Rhett would sit by the fire and plan for the future they were building together. We should get more chickens, Clara said one night, her head resting on Rhett's shoulder. Maybe some pigs, too. We'll need more feed storage first. I was thinking of expanding the barn. Rhett's arm tightened around her. This is real, isn't it? This is actually happening. It's real. Clara tilted her head to look at him. Are you happy? Happier than I ever thought I'd be. He kissed her forehead gently. My brother told me to find something worth living for. Took me 14 years, but I finally did. We all did, Clara said softly. We found each other. Spring came slowly, melting the last of the snow and turning the world green and new. Clara's garden flourished. The children grew stronger, healthier, louder. Rhett built furniture and fixed everything that was broken and taught Samuel how to fish in the creek that ran through their property. And one morning, Clara woke up and realized she was in love with her husband. Not the desperate, all-consuming love she'd felt for Thomas when she was young and naive. This was steadier, deeper, built on trust and partnership and the knowledge that they'd both survived the worst life could throw at them and come out stronger. I love you, she told Rhett that night, the words simple but weighted with everything she felt. Rhett's eyes widened, then softened with emotion. I love you too. Have for a while now, but I wasn't sure. I'm sure. Clara kissed him, slow and deep. I'm so sure. 6 months after they arrived at the homestead, a rider came with news from town. Luther Kane had been arrested for fraud. Turned out he'd been falsifying loan documents for years, cheating dozens of families. The sheriff was sorting it out, returning money where he could. Good, Clara said simply. He can't hurt anyone else now. A year after that, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Hope. Rhett held the baby with trembling hands, tears streaming down his scarred face as he counted her tiny fingers and toes. "She's perfect," he whispered. "They're all perfect." Clara watched her husband with their new baby and their older children clustered around, all of them loud and healthy and alive, and felt gratitude so profound it was almost painful. They'd survived. More than survived. They'd built something beautiful from the ashes of loss and desperation. 2 years after their marriage, on a bright summer morning, Clara stood on the porch of their homestead and watched her children play. Maggie was teaching Samuel to read. The twins were chasing chickens. Lizzie was helping Rhett in the garden while baby Hope, not so much a baby anymore, toddled after them on unsteady legs. Rhett caught her eye and smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. Clara smiled back, her heart full. "Mama," Samuel called, "come see what I can read." "Coming, sweetheart." As Clara walked toward her family, she thought about the desperate woman she'd been 3 years ago, standing in a frozen marketplace with 3 pennies and 5 starving children. That woman had whispered, "We haven't eaten in days," and believed she was watching her children die. But a scarred cowboy with sad eyes had heard her, had chosen to help, had promised never hungry again, and kept that promise against impossible odds. And now, standing in the sunlight with her family around her, Clara understood that Rhett had given them more than food. He'd given them safety, stability, hope. He'd shown them that family wasn't just about blood. It was about choice, about showing up every day and choosing to love even when it was hard. "Mama, look!" Samuel held up his book proudly. "I read the whole page." "That's wonderful, baby." Clara knelt beside him, pulling him into a hug. Rhett appeared at her side, Hope balanced on his hip. "Everything all right?" Clara looked up at her husband, at the man who'd saved her family and become part of it, who'd traded his brother's watch and his beloved horse, and his self-imposed isolation for the chance to be their father, their protector, their home. "Everything's perfect," she said. And it was. They'd survived the winter that should have killed them. They'd paid the debts that should have destroyed them. They'd built a life from nothing but stubbornness and hope and the willingness to keep trying when everything seemed impossible. Clara Callahan would never forget the taste of desperation, the sound of her children's hunger, the weight of believing she'd failed them. But she would also never forget the moment a stranger became family, or the way love could grow from the smallest seed of kindness. That night, after the children were all asleep, Clara stood in the doorway watching the stars come out, Rhett's arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her close. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how far we've come, about how different things could have been." Clara turned in his arms, looking up at his scarred, beautiful face. "About how grateful I am that you heard me that day, that you cared enough to help." "I'll always hear you," Rhett promised. "I'll always care. That's what family means." "Yes," Clara agreed, kissing him softly. "That's exactly what it means." Behind them, the cabin glowed with warm light. Inside, 6 children slept safely, their bellies full, their futures bright. Outside, the Wyoming night was clear and cold and infinite with possibility. And Clara knew, with the certainty that comes from surviving the impossible, that they would never be hungry again, not while they had each other, not while love kept them warm, not while Rhett Callahan kept his promise, a promise made in the frozen depths of winter that had bloomed into the most beautiful spring any of them had ever known. The end.